This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Jens Martin Skibsted. He is a designer. Now, before you think we're only going to be talking about a mechanical or a physical product, we do go there, but we go much wider and proved. We discuss Jens' new book, Expand, Stretching the Future by Design. What a great title. If we can only get there, I give Jens credit. He is in the game fighting, getting people to think about these wider and broadest conversation with Jens Martin Skibsted. I got a jump in question for you. This is kind of a big picture perspective. And I was thinking to myself in advance of this call, I was thinking, okay, about design and something from my life that I'm dealing with. And it dovetails into several issues in your world. First off, two examples of Silicon Valley technology usage that have kind of hit me this year so far. Number one, I have wanted to cut back on my Facebook, to delete years and years of posts. This is a nightmare process. It appears to be done on purpose or incompetence. I'm not sure. Number two, I'm a lifelong Mac guy. So I've been using Mac products for, 30 years. However, over the holidays in the States, I bought the newest iPhone 13. It is now 5 months later. I have not unboxed it and started using it because for the two SIM cards that I currently have on an iPhone 7 and an iPhone 10, they work quite fine. And the newest iPhone, this thing 13, feels like a piece of lead. It's heavy. I'll add a third one in there just to cover all my bases for all of Silicon Valley. If I have to think about logging into any Google product, every time I think to myself, there must not be any designers at Google. It must be all engineers, and slightly about technological determinism when it comes to Silicon Valley. I want to understand your perspective.
Yes. So as you say, some of these things are not necessarily thought of for users, at least only, but also in terms of how to drive revenue. And even if they are thought as things for users to use, then they come, as you say, with an engineering perspective. One of my pet peeves are these beep noises that your washing machine or dryer or whichever makes when it's done. You wonder, why is it that you need this beep all night long? I think Marissa Mayer was at Google. She was the design lead at some point. There is some design thinking there, but it's very much this approach that the more technology we get, the happier we are. There's this global trend going in a different way where we're looking, how can we, for instance, innovate with the minimum of energy? How can we stay more human? Or even how can we go past the human aspect? But if we stay a little bit less abstract, what the Silicon Valley approach is very much linked to this perspective that there are only two stakeholders that need to profit from it. One is the end consumer, and secondly, the shareholder. But often the shareholder is at the advantage. I work for a design company called Manyone that also does digital design. Customers will consciously and actively ask for dark design. When you say dark design, this is, I think, what you would describe when you were frustrated with Facebook. There are certain things that these companies just do not want you to press. For instance, delete the account or get customer service, anything that will count in a negative direction commercially. So they make it extremely hard to find. That is actually a non-user-centric design that's consciously put in place.
What's interesting about what you bring up there, though, too, is the idea, for example, with Facebook, but you could say this with other companies, the idea that if you have a problem with something like Facebook, there's no human to talk to. Okay, that's fine. I get it. It's a free model. I use it, whatever, for a long time. But then the real issue becomes you start to feel like you're stuck in a cage where we could be doing so much better, but because this one organization has such a monopoly and they got everyone's, I can do better.
The internet, unfortunately, with this huge liberating power as it has, there's been this backlash, as we know, both politically, but also commercially, that you now try to box things in. And if you think of the metaverse that in some shape or form is going to come, even just as being within one company contradicts the whole idea. The metaverse is actually being able to more or less seamlessly move from, let's say, you playing Fortnite till you checking the news on CNBC to checking out your Facebook stuff. This seamless movement, the moment you have one company wanting to...
Facebook, they're a good one to pick on, but it's not believable that when a CEO, for example, of Facebook comes out and gives these nice, tidy interviews and this empathetic, glossy-eyed look where we're just the Borg here to help you. As you just lay out, what kind of life is that if your so-called real life is logging into Facebook and then...
I brought up being exposed to them. At some point, what really struck me about those, how do I fulfill myself? What do I do? Like you see in the movie Hair, with this guy being free and then this woman left alone with her kid. I'm saying this because a lot of the Bay Area tech movement actually came from this counterculture that wanted to set people free, that wanted to refocalize. And of course, there are tons of positive things involved in that, the anti-war movement, whatnot. But there's this incredible individualism or focus on oneself that got propagated out in the internet, all over the internet. So you had these very good intentions. Basically, we're going to more or less set you all free. All of this self-centeredness permeated throughout the internet. That's an interpretation, but I think there's some truth to it. When Facebook started, I would be really surprised if they were quote-unquote bad guys. It's just they got caught by surprise by the technology. Once you have the money flowing, you don't want to see it go away. There is this naivete around technology in general. When you look at technology, you somehow assume that there's a natural progression and you just need to follow that. There's very little of this. Let's stop and look around. What kind of world do we desire? What kind of society do we desire? And then make sure whatever technology it is we use or develop, that somehow it fits with that. Right now, it seems as if it's inversed, that we've developed super cool technology, and for some reason, we just believe that it's going to dictate our life and not vice versa.
Good example of that, or at least I hope it's a good example of that, would be the iPhone situation that I brought up earlier. Functionally, except for a little bit of speed, the iPhone doesn't do much different than it did when I first got one in 2013. Now, I love Apple products, okay, but at some stage of the game, can I really even understand the benefits of the processing speed on a phone? Can I understand the RAM benefits? Can I understand that extra million pixels of color that I'm supposedly getting for my phone? And this is a design, a business design that they have put me into. Again, they're not alone. I see it in food these days. I mean, food and pharmaceutical products expire. If you look at the expiration date, seemingly expire 6 months after you buy something. There's a lot of design these days that's simply built off profit, and profit that, okay, I get it, but it's not helping us.
Yeah, designing things with a specific lifespan, design for obsolescence, it's called, that became a thing, I think, in the 80s, coming from Denmark, where your perspective had always been when you made a product, it has to last forever. It was completely mind-blowing that you would not make the best possible product you could. But of course, even in the Danish culture, this was also adapted because you just make more money if stuff breaks. You're going to sell more of it. You for sure have that design for obsolescence. I think they've actually been caught red-handed doing it. Apple, it's not to pinpoint Apple. It's an industry norm. It's not them specifically. There's so many examples of this. For instance, the plugs that you have to use for Apple are different from the others. And then at some point, they even changed those. So you would have to buy a whole new set. Everything basically is made to maximize, and there's not this understanding that our planet cannot really take more of throwing stuff out. When you look at greenhouse gas emissions, everybody says, well, it's, let's say, transport or building or this and that sector that's the culprit. But at the end of the day, the most emissions are emitted by sheer consumption. Consumption in itself is not bad, but consumption of material goods strains the world because we don't have a circular economy where we reuse the stuff, we just throw it out. We need to revisit some of these things, and it would be a shame if we had to do it by, let's say, political brute force. that some of these companies can't just see that by themselves and keep, in a way, digging themselves down in a hole.
I'm going to bring it back to climate change in a moment because you brought up an interesting point that I want to go down that rabbit hole. But let me keep it at Danish culture for a moment because I think there's some interesting areas here to mine. The phrase, and you can explain it to the audience, get to Denmark. And I have a good friend that lives in Denmark. She happens to be Indonesian, married to a Danish guy. Why don't you explain the phrase get to Denmark? Because look, this is a country of, I believe my numbers are right here, 5.8 million people. I believe the population is 86% Dane, and I think Norway is second, but primarily other countries, the small percentage of the population is other European countries primarily. So it's a pretty homogenous place, a pretty homogenous, rich country, very successful, a lot to look up to. But why don't you speak to this phrase, get to Denmark?
Many people see Denmark as something of an exception. I spoke once with a Harvard economist, and I asked him, so this model that you have does not really fit well with the Scandinavian countries. He just looked at me and said, there's no model that fits with the Scandinavian countries.
What did he mean by that?
He means that some of the things that are typical for the Scandinavian countries is there are a lot of socialist things that are done. Most money is recirculated. 50% of our money goes into the states, 25% of our taxes goes into the state. Even then, when our kids are supposed to inherit, a lot of that goes to the state. So there's a huge amount of money being circulated and redistributed by the state. That would to some seem like pure socialism. And at the same time, we're very, very market driven. If we want to lay off people here in Denmark, we just lay them off. How do we make our money? We make our money by having businesses, growing businesses. At the same time as we are very socialist, on an average, we're among the countries with most money per capita. So there's this strange dialectic. This coming to Denmark was a thing that Fukuyama said at some point that we ideally should all be there. Because if you looked at what created the strength in the American economy, originally it was the middle class. There are very few countries still where you have a strong middle class. You still have that in Scandinavia. It's still the middle that controls the country.
The only place where there's a growing middle class, I believe, is in Asia.
Yeah. Asia and Africa are the only continents that are actually growing in general in terms of population. So I think it's this ideal Lilliputian nation that people see from outside that can seem too fairy tale-like to actually be applicable to other places. It's small, it's homogeneous. So there are some arguments for why you would not be able to achieve that other places. But then again, people should not aspire to be Scandinavian. People should aspire to be whoever they want to be. And we're seeing examples of that other places in the world where nations use some of the similar design techniques to become whoever they want to be. Rwanda is a great country to take as an example in terms of tech leading in a host of areas. For instance, transporting of medicines. You have Wi-Fi in old buses. They came out, at least at some points, the best in terms of fighting corona. They had all sorts of very frugal techniques to achieve something very different that at the same time respected their own cultural norms, was really in a global competition. You have other places in the Americas, Bolivia, I think Peru as well. There are a few countries where they've started to look at we have this wonderful nature around us, this ecosystem that's breaking down. It's hurting us and it's hurting the planet. So how can we do anything about that? Because all our rights, all value is counted on how humans get more. Humans always get more, let's say, if they can just take a forest and slash it down and then use it for some random crop. But indirectly, it's not really true. Indirectly, our society and world is threatened by just slashing down the rainforest. So they've started giving ecosystems rights as humans. Actually, this is also true for New Zealand. Certain rivers can actually go to court, or you can go to court on behalf of that river as if it was a legal entity.
I don't think that idea is odd. Some people might immediately hear you say that and say, gosh, that sounds crazy. When I go to see the redwood trees outside San Francisco, to protect those, for those trees to have rights, absolutely makes perfect sense because once they're gone, they're gone.
I totally agree with that. A lot of law is set in stone, and it's really difficult to say all of a sudden, hey, legal entities are not just humans. For lawmakers, that is a complete revolution. If you think of how many legal fights there's been in the US in terms of what does the Constitution say, what is the base law, if you can still keep going back 100 years to say what should be the law today, imagine how you deal with such an innovative thing. This is a challenge with a lot of innovation. Somehow people believe innovation belongs to the private sector realm. Innovation should be permeate through everything. It should also be a thing for public service, for law. It's just very challenging to apply these innovations where it's not already applied.
Let me give you a little setup. So you happen to be speaking to, perhaps you recognize the accent, an American today. You happen to be speaking to an American who's in Saigon, Vietnam, who happens to have been here for, oh my gosh, approaching a decade. So I've got an interesting perspective than my fellow countrymen because not many of them have pulled this kind of a feat off in a country like I have. The thing that I find interesting, to take it back to the word culture, we talked about Denmark, you brought up Rwanda. I can think of Vietnam. One of the most interesting things for me being in Vietnam is the homogeneity. I'm curious your perspective when it comes to design, where you need to have people, frankly, somewhat happy, somewhat aligned, not necessarily fearful of their neighbor, or at least cooperating with their neighbor. As I've gotten older here now, I find the American mantra of diversity, we're the most diverse place, we're the best place. I think a lot of countries around the world must have been, for the last 50 years, scratching their head and saying, well, okay, you guys are diverse and we're homogenous, so does that make us evil? Now, after I have this little sojourn over the last decade to live in a homogenous country, boy, there's some advantages. It seems like you can really rally people and get people together perhaps easier. America is what America is. I'm just curious if you'd like to comment on why is the Danish culture so good? What about the culture? Does it get to the root of the fact that most people are just similar? You kind of feel like brothers and sisters. Why are you harming your brothers and sisters? Is that what's the root of a Denmark or a Rwanda or a Vietnam? Is that the root of it?
It makes it easier, not necessarily in terms of ethnicity, but in terms of value system. If you have the same value system, it is going to be easier. Things today go incredibly fast. The speed of innovation is super, super fast. If we have to take a break and say, hey, let's first figure out what our values are, which is what I'm actually asking or suggesting people to do, then of course you're going to put some time lag in there. I think the US looks very multicultural because people, quote unquote, have different colors. But if you take Rwanda, you have very different ethnicities.
Different ethnicities, but a common culture.
That is a good question. I cannot really answer that, but it's not always true. I've traveled a bit in the Gambia, and you have people that to foreigners look pretty much the same with different ethnicities and also very, very different cultures. Some are warrior cultures, some are not. And it really does make a difference. So I don't actually know to which degree these different ethnicities in Rwanda have different cultures or not. But I was sitting in front of the Minister of the Justice Department. I asked him, so how are you now going to avoid that there's not a new massacre? Because the way we did things in Europe was that basically we cleansed ethnicities out. I mean, I'm exaggerating quite a bit, but it's not completely untrue. There was a lot of ethnic cleansing over a couple of millennia. So France now, there's more or less only one language. The same is true for Great Britain. It was multicultural, but kind of one culture won. And so I asked him, if this was the recipe, how are you going to avoid not having that kind of cleansing again? He said, when the Belgians came, what they did every morning in school was they had a roll call. The Hutus were asked to stand up. Then after the roll call was for Tutsis, and then at the end it was for Twas. He said, this is what we will stop doing. We will stop differentiating between the different ethnicities because we're not doing it before and there was no problem before. If you think of a multicultural society like the US that is extremely multicultural, it's also a very segregated culture. So you actually have to say, do you identify as let's say African American, Caucasian, all of these different categories, made up categories, but because they are made up, or rather, although they are made up, they still then create an identity. By creating this identity that's segregated from the others, you do have tensions. So I think it is possible to have societies with less tension.
Let me save you from that one. Because look, America is, you and I know this, we could talk for weeks about America. And of course, we would not get to any resolution. Let me take you back to climate change. And I want to let you put on your design hat, so to speak, perhaps even getting into your work, expand on a way that you would think about some design solutions. Something like climate change is very complicated. Here's the caveat that I want to lay on top of it. A lot of people around the world might look at Northern European countries, Western European countries, and they might say, hey, you guys were running around the planet in the last several hundred years, colonial powers, and you took a lot back to the home base. You got your wealth, and now you're kind of sitting at the top of the food chain, so to speak. Whereas in this part of the world, in Asia, people are still, they're playing catch up. Even more so, to add to this complexity, to look at a country like China. China probably doesn't have any desire to really play by Western rules, so to speak. They are competing with themselves. They're competing against the rest of the world. I know they felt like they were held down for a long time, and now they're coming back. Coming from Denmark, and you've got this design perspective. We've got all these complicated issues around the world, country to country. Because sometimes I hear the climate change conversation. It's like, we can just maybe wave a magic wand, but hold on. Each nation state has got its own desires and own goals. They're each stage of development. It's quite complicated. So from a design perspective, how do you start to bring people into this conversation on potential solutions?
Yes, that's a tough one. But the thing is, it's not like there's an Asian stance, there's an African stance or European stance. And if you take the Paris Agreement, some of the nations that really drove this through were actually African nations. They are going to be most challenged by what's going to happen, although they are the least part of the problem. Each country has to see how it benefits them the most. When I started to make speeches out in mainland China, I'm a bicycle buff and a Copenhagenizer, so to say, like someone that suggests that we use bicycles in cities instead of cars. When I said that in mainland China many years ago, like 15 years ago, people got angry at me because it was, I think, what you're saying that, okay, so you've had your turn, you've driven around in nice, luxurious cars, and now we got a bike, and we can't have that. This was not really what I was saying. I was saying that nice bikes can compete with bad cars. But that completely changed around from being some kind of attack on the future of Chinese people, so to say. The Chinese government turned around and said, well, actually, bicycles, we are the nation with the most bikes. This is actually a proper Chinese thing to bike. The alternative to the American dream, which they have a Chinese dream. Bicycles should be part of that. That's one way of finding where is your culture rooted and how can that serve making the planet greener.
You need to bring the bicycle back to Vietnam. They've adopted the motorbike. They need the bicycle back.
That is true. I had the most fun ever biking around in Hanoi. This is many, many years ago, but it was more like a fish show driving around than bike lanes. It was really fun. Everybody knew where one was intuitively. So yeah, I really hope that comes back, but it's true. Hanoi is actually, I know Vietnam is more than Hanoi, but it's one of those interesting cities like Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso that you had the shift away from bikes, but it went to motorized two-wheelers instead of cars. In that sense, it's very peculiar, but I agree with you. Electric bikes now could do the job.
You've actually designed bikes, is it?
Yeah, the most things I've designed are actually bikes. Again, here I've tried to take it very much from a, let's say, quote unquote, capitalistic point of view to say that end of the day, if people will choose bike, they will choose them not because they will be forced out of their cars. You need to make them desirable. That is the oldest design tool in the textbook. Make something that's not desirable now, desirable. That has been really what I've been attempting to do.
Everyone listening right now, and I've not had a chance to ride one of your bikes, but everyone listening right now can imagine a bicycle. I think everyone's probably seen some of the newer bikes that get quite expensive and whatnot, and there's all kinds of innovation in terms of material and the gears and all kinds of stuff. What did you figure out in the designing of your bikes that you could share with us that would kind of give us an aha moment into your aha moment of where you said, well, gosh, it's a bike. Obviously, bikes came before you. So what did you do and how did you get inspired to do it?
The main epiphany I had was that people in cities, they want to express themselves. If you look like a cool city dweller and you walk out in the outback, people are going to laugh at you. But if you are in a city and, have colored hair, got a fur on and weird shoes, people might think you're cool. It was odd to me that these very expressive bikes that you have, the sports bikes, were in the countryside, whereas in the cities, we tended to have a little bit more quote unquote crappy bikes. I wanted to take that expressiveness into the city, and all of the expensive parts, they were made for, let's say, mountain bikes or road bikes, whereas the parts for cities were very cheap parts. How can we make exclusive city bikes that harness the longing for identity that city dwellers have? On top of that, there was a host of design ideas, such as making it super simple to use, which sounds obvious, but is actually not true. If you take a lot of sports bike, you will have combination gears of 30 gears, and you will have suspension. You have to twist all sorts of levers. Bikes are extremely complex to drive compared to a car, which in theory should be much more complex. So reducing that complexity, then there was a host of specific innovations. Chainless, so bikes without chains. One of them had a wire as a down tube that would use to lock the bike, meaning that if you cut that wire, you would basically destroy the entire bike, which is not so motivating if you want to use it afterwards when you steal it. A host of innovations, night glow bikes and stuff like that.
We brought up some technology for carriers. Not much has changed in my life, whether I get on United, American, and look, there's some European carriers that I don't think too highly of, but there are some air carriers around the world where their experience, just a typical public carrier that anyone can buy a ticket on, and the experience is just a joy. I can think of Emirates or ANA out of Japan. When you start to think about complicated issues like that, we can all talk about why, for example, something like United Airlines just doesn't change. It must drive you crazy sometimes, though, that you as a designer, when you see something like this, and you know we could all have so much more joy in life, things could be better, and we just can't get there on so many different design fronts.
Here again, for instance, regulation is a challenge. Innovation has to come hand in hand with public sector. And here, the security measures we have today are tight, which they probably should be, but they're also defined in which way they should be tight. So although now we have a lot of factory technologies, we could smell a bomb with a machine and be able to open up these gateways. That's very difficult to do because of regulatory issues. Even just the pollution part of it. There's also how do bikes work with other types of infrastructure. In European airports, there are some where the high-speed trains actually go direct up close to the airport. Then there's industrial design. Why, for instance, are all seats in a plane at the same level? I know you have some planes with 2 stories, but they are all 2 dimensions. They're all flat. Why are some of the seats not higher than others? They haven't even been optimized in terms of space management, which doesn't mean necessarily you need to cramp more people in, but it means you could sit more leisurely just by doing that. If you take some of the high-end companies you mentioned, what is special to them is that they have a specific smell design and olfactory design. So they will have a perfume emitted that reminds you of this brand. So there's a host of ways you can go about this.
How do you get people to the table, though? I'm bringing this up with you because I imagine you walk into the room, maybe you're sitting down with a bunch of airline executives or whatnot, and you want to get them to have this open design conversation. For me, as a casual observer, I look at something like United Airlines and I just say they haven't changed. I want to say it's because of money. They don't want to spend the money or they don't have the money. I can get on United Airlines. I could get in one of their cabins and the experience dealing with United staff versus ANA staff or Thai Airways staff or Singapore Airlines staff is entirely different. So this design element, if we're just talking airlines as an example, runs through everything, including the people, how they're selected, how they're trained. There's so many issues here that we are leaving flat and we're not designing better.
The irony is that at this point, even both McKinsey and Harvard Business Review have really researched the effects of having this cooperative, participatory design, and it shows up in bottom line. Design-driven companies just do better, as if the CEO or top management did not have anything to do with design. But that's actually where it starts. So if the CEO understands design techniques, then it can permeate down.
If the CEO just works his way up and grinds his way to the top, he might be very good at grinding his way to the top, but he might not have the skill set or vision needed to do exactly what you and I are having a conversation about.
That is true. But there are companies that have been exceptional because of it. At some point, I remember around the turn of the millennium, people were talking about it would be good to manage quality. But if you say that today, oh, we've got good quality management as a USP, people are going to laugh at you because, yeah, obviously you got to have that. It's kind of a hygienic factor. Otherwise, I wouldn't even start buying your products. These design methodologies, they will somehow at some point become hygienic factors. People will expect you to have thought of the entire experience. The challenge, of course, then will be to go beyond private, to work with NGOs, to work with public sector and so on. There is no clear manager who manages that. So that's going to be more challenging. On the private sector, you, for instance, have Samsung that at some point decided design is just too important to be left to designers, and we need design at all areas of our business. You still cannot become a manager in Samsung without having half a year design management and design thinking course. And you can see the effects of that.
Taking from your book, I just love these few little sentences here from your work: how we design, what we design, who we design for, how long we design for, just to get the audience thinking that when we go through our everyday life, no matter what we're doing, somebody has been considering those 4 issues, whether they do it well or not well. There's been some attempt at it. We just often notice the ones that have done an exceptional job.
Sometimes there has not been enough thought into these, especially the one you mentioned about time. Somehow, at least in the West, we look maybe 4 years ahead. Then there's going to be a new government, or in business, we might just look 3 months ahead because then you have the next quarterly. That kind of time span between 3 months to 4 years, everything is measured in that. Very little goes beyond that, or is faster than that for that matter. We're in a world where, for instance, global warming, if we need to solve that, we can't just keep thinking 4 years ahead. We might want to think, let's say, 15 years ahead or 40 years ahead for that matter. That whole time perspective, we need to dig into that and think about it.
You bring up the issue with a pronoun there. You say we. We need to think ahead. And that gets back to my counter of each individual nation state. The we is hard to do when it comes to something like climate change. For example, something that I hope doesn't happen. It's quite sad, but one of the world's biggest rivers starting up in, I believe, Tibet, coming down to the Mekong Delta. The Mekong River has been dammed 20 or 30 times in the last 20 years. This is running through the lives of 1 billion people. These kinds of things. I probably have some listeners that are immediately thinking that I'm hugging a tree. Well, I'm hugging the Mekong River, because if the Mekong River goes away, this is not a good thing. We can find examples like this all across the world. How do you balance each nation's desires and wants and goals? It's quite tricky.
End of the day, there is some geopolitical power at stake, and some people will defend their rights. Others will challenge those rights. In terms of water, we have very, very bad international laws. If the water starts on my side of the fence, I can just claim it all to me. And on your side of the fence, your lawn and your kids were dependent on the water that we shared. Now, no longer you have it. And that, of course, is going to cause a lot of problems.
It's going to cause war, right? It'll cause war at some stage.
Exactly. But also that threat of war will make people think about it, that we do need to sit together because nobody wants that war. If people want to go to war for oil, for sure they will go to war over water, right? No one will accept that their kids cannot get water. It's a difficult thing. There is no real global government. Somehow we need to negotiate these things globally. You had this example of the West being the colonizers or the Europeans being the colonizers. That also meant that a lot of the law that we have in place is Western, and we do enforce it. Now, by default, it is international law. If you take a lot of law that regulates design, it's IP law, so intellectual property law. But then you get challenges. For instance, some innovation in West Africa is actually not developed by one specific person, but by a community. And it was not necessarily a community that's living today, but it's been developed over centuries by that community. How do you protect this? They have developed it. Somehow it's their property, but in theory, someone can take it and claim as his. All of a sudden, you have this community that lost. You've got to find new models.
A good example of that might be the Russian oligarchs. Early 90s, all of a sudden, 20 people took all of the minerals and oil of Russia. I don't think that was necessarily good for the Russian people.
No, for sure not. You're probably right. I haven't thought about that, but it could be, again, that suddenly they had to buy into this very individualistic approach that a lot of the West has. It's not about society necessarily. That is, I have to say, one of the things, speaking about getting to Denmark, that is a little bit special that end of the day, society will matter more than the individual. The individual still have rights. This balance of how much should the individual be protected and how much is it about society, how much is it about nature versus humans, all of these balances we need to, let's say, recalibrate, rebalance, figure out what really works going forward.
It's a great example, though, too, because I can think as an American, before I came to be in a place like Asia, in a socialist country, generally as Americans, we grew up with let's protect our individual rights. One of the reasons Americans grow up with the mindset of let's protect our individual rights is because perhaps there's just this underlying chaos that you can't necessarily trust everyone that you're around. Whereas being in a place like Vietnam, my observation would be when it comes to individual rights versus community rights, you could probably feel that my perspective has changed some, because when you're in a nice cultural place that works well and the people are generally almost like brothers and sisters, well, this changes your mindset when it comes to the absolute pursuit of individual rights.
If you look over a longer time perspective, 10,000 years, the people that lived in Vietnam over the past 10,000 years have not been one homogeneous group without any conflicts. It's been like everywhere else in the world, a place of turmoil, of change, of wars, of new people settling in. Denmark, 10,000 years, were not the people that are here. They didn't look like me, did not speak like me, and they got kicked out of Denmark, etc. This is just past the history we normally measure. If you look on the longer perspective, anything can be redressed. Danes were actually the country that has been at war with most European countries. Originally, we were Vikings. You've probably heard of Vikings. Fairly brutal also compared to Taliban people. Today, we're extremely peaceful.
That's what you say, you're peaceful. I don't know if I come there. Who knows? I'm going to get the Viking treatment or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it's good you don't have a visual right now. So I think end of the day, if Americans came together and said, this is what we want to achieve, we want to find our commonalities. We want to be one community instead of a lot of segregated ethnicities, that could be achieved. That is a thing you choose. As the Minister of Justice in Rwanda said, well, I choose that we will come together. If he had to persecute those that had done war crimes, he would have had to persecute a third of a nation. In the US, you would be, if you discount kids, roughly 100 million people you put to jail. That is not a feasible thing. So you got to find another way. Even where there's most animosity, there is a way to design your way out of it.
I'm thinking about Singapore. I'm a 2-hour flight from Singapore, and I'm thinking of their leader, Lee Kuan Yew, back in the day in the 1960s, essentially a benevolent dictator. And as are most, democracy or not, most countries in Asia, you would argue today, or not you, but anybody would argue, are benevolent dictators, except for North Korea. They have some problems up there. But most people, there's a galvanizing force, whereas we keep coming back to America. America's got these two sides. Often it's the politicians who are craving power, but those two sides don't come together very well. Whereas if I bring up a Singapore, you and I know, I'm not sure if you've been there, I'm guessing you have, but Singapore, from a design perspective, we could talk about design all day long when it comes to Singapore, and they've done exceptionally well. It's quite frankly a joy to go to Singapore. Sometimes it might be a little boring. It's so nice, but it's designed very, very well.
Yeah, for sure. They really believe in design, and they also believe that there is no, on one side, a public and other side, a private, that everything needs to be one coherent design. This dichotomy that we have in the West, where we say either you are a totalitarian state or you are democracy, there are shades, as you say, but also democracy, we define it as how it is defined today. Who says that we have to have an election day? Why doesn't everybody go to election on their birthday? There's so many things we could so easily change that might even take away some of the populism we have today, because how are you going to have a populist campaign 24/7 for 4 years in a row? There are many tools out there to redesign stuff, also democracies. I personally believe in democracies, but I think they could be so much better. Innovation within politics and institutions is just not there. We can make things better all over if we want to.
You do a great job in your book, taking people down this path. I hope you enjoyed the directions I took you. I didn't necessarily know where we were going to go. The book, Expand, Stretching the Future by Design, I'm sure some people would hear that title and think it's only about designing bicycles, but clearly your mindset and your perspective is wide and global. Where can we send people to the book, all the bookstores, Amazon, etc.? Is there a website you would like to direct people to check you out?
There's one called expandthefuture.com.
Well, thanks for coming on. I appreciate the conversation. You and I, we could probably expand this out, except we both have to have a life. We could probably expand this conversation out to a 10-hour conversation quite quickly because there's so many tangents that go off when you start to think about design, even if many people might immediately jump to Steve Jobs designing an Apple product, which is great. Don't get me wrong, but it's just much more than that.
Yeah, I could easily have gone on. We only touched upon a lot of very interesting alleys.
I appreciate you coming on. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.